I thought it was fun, so I don't really care. So I'm gonna explain it from the top. All right, just to get a nice clip. So this is the chart. This is the chart we use to deduce what an RPG is. We've finally solved it. This is the solution to RPGs. Okay. So this is your X and Y. The Y is the physical exertion required to play the game, and the X is the amount of strategy involved in playing the game. Okay, so you plot your extremes first. 0, 0 is doing nothing. No amount of physical exercise and no amount of mental exercise. Sitting there doing nothing requires nothing from you, and it's 0, 0. That's your baseline. The hardest physical thing you could do with the least amount of strategy involved, we've concluded, is deadlifting, because it's extremely physical exerting, but doesn't require any strategy. The opposite of this would be the least physical thing you could possibly do with the most amount of strategy involved, which would be something like chess or like Go, where you can do it completely in your mind and you don't even have to like lift things up to move chess pieces and stuff. You know, it's not actually at 0, you know, because you actually have to move the pieces and stuff, but close enough. The extreme of both would be like playing Go or chess, but the pieces themselves are like 600 pounds, so moving them requires an insane amount of physical exertion. So those are like your extremes, all 4 extremes. And then we have this green line, which is the physical ceiling of video games. So video games can never possibly be above this line. And that is just useful for the charting, right? So this right here, blue, is like Guitar Hero. Very minimal amount of strategy involved, but an insane amount of physical execution. Like if you're gonna play Through the Fire and Flames on Expert, you gotta have fast fingers and shit. But it doesn't require much strategy, just some memorization. Not much thinking going on, pure execution. This blue line is the average of all games that exist, basically. As we go down to less execution heavy games, you're gonna have a more centered amount of games. If you plotted every single game that exists on this chart, most of them would average on this line and around here. This box is what we came to as the conclusion of RPGs. So my hypothesis was that RPGs are games that fall into not being too physical and not being too strategic. Because there are games that have things that people would call RPG elements, but there's not enough of them that have enough impact on the way the game is played to accurately describe that game as an RPG. So an example of a game that is an RPG or has RPG elements that is too reliant on the physical elements of the game to be considered an RPG would be something like Devil May Cry, where the orb system and like the shop and stuff is a pseudo RPG. You get to pick different moves and builds and stats that you can buff depending on what you choose, and those are RPG elements, but it's too reliant on the physical aspect, the actual execution of the gameplay, for that to be considered an RPG. The opposite end of the spectrum would be games that are too reliant on strategy to be considered an RPG. And my example was something maybe like StarCraft, you know, where it's got so much strategy involved that even though lots of the mechanics are something that you would see similar in an RPG, it's not considered an RPG because it requires too much strategy on the behalf of the player for that to be considered an RPG. Other things would be like other real-time strategy games like Age of Empires, stuff like that, where the physical execution isn't necessarily as high as maybe something like deadlifting or Guitar Hero, but can still maybe be something like StarCraft, maybe like up here. You know, maybe it's too physically exerting to be an RPG. So we tried to figure out what is like the quintessential hardest RPG on like a physical or strategic level. And what we said is like maybe like right here at the tip of the graph is something like an MMO, like World of Warcraft. You know, lots of inputs if you're not using macros, and lots of strategy. You have to, if you're doing like a raid, you got tons of different people you got to organize and different strategies you got to do. But most people would say that that is an RPG. Now, this line is basically subjective, right? The reason it doesn't extend all the way to the bottom is if a game can be an RPG if it has absolutely zero strategy, or actually a game can still be an RPG if it has absolutely no physical components but does have some strategy, like auto play or like grinding RPGs. Like you're not pressing any buttons at all, you just set up the strategy beforehand. But you can't have it the other way around. You can't have it just be physical but not have any strategy at all, otherwise it's not an RPG. Because there has to be some sort of decisions being made for the role to be played. This orange line is turn-based games. This is kind of an experiment where, like, well, turn-based games are inherently less physically execution heavy, but lots of them are RPGs, but not all turn-based games are RPGs. Like chess is not an RPG, but it is turn-based, as an example. So I say this is just all anecdotal, this is just a thought experiment, which it is, but you could quantifiably prove this if you really wanted to. So you could independently measure the amount of calories burnt physically when playing a game. So what you do is you take like 1,000 people and you have them play a game to its completion, and you measure their brain activity and their calories burnt while doing so, and you average that out across all the people that played the game, and you can quantifiably measure where on the chart, on average, the game is going to be. It's going to be slightly different for every individual experience, but you can quantify it roughly on this chart. You do that for every game that ever exists to fill the chart with different plot points, with different games, and then you can do a census of which games people colloquially think are RPGs. And if you do that, then you're going to end up with the average conclusion, which is something like this. Right? And there's going to be outliers. Not every RPG is going to be necessarily 100% like compliant to this, and different people are going to have different opinions, but it's going to give you something like this. And where each individual game is going to be, this can not be 100% accurate, but you'll get something like this. And my whole conclusion was the closer that a game gets to 0-0, which is doing nothing, the more of an RPG it is. So RPGs are just doing nothing, basically, which is why all of the human activities that I enjoy doing are outside of this list. This entire graph is just explaining why I don't like RPGs. Because personally, I think this is boring. I mean, it's okay to enjoy stuff in here. I just don't. And this is my way of explaining why. Because what is similar about these games is the amount of pressure on you as the player to exert either physical or strategic energy is so low that it's uninteresting. To me, personally. And for me, it just so happens to fundamentally land on like this line roughly. Although there are some games in here that I do enjoy. Put this on YouTube? Yeah, I was going to. So what kind of RPG is charted that far out on the x-axis? It'd be like WoW. Like plotting like exact games like in exact spots is hard. You'd have to do the data first. Like you'd have to like actually measure it. But if I had to guess, it'd be something like WoW.